Hi, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. Hello, everyone. I am your host today, Paige Niedringhouse, and I am joined by Shruti Kapoor, a staff engineer and developer educator, and she is here to talk about what's new in React 2025. Welcome back, Shruti.
Hi, Paige. I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I am very good, and I am very glad that you're here. You've been on PodRocket before, so we are thrilled to have you back. There's a lot that's happened to React in 2025, so maybe you could just start from the top with some of the biggest new changes that people should be aware of.
Yeah, actually, in 2025, there were 3 releases that went out in React. The most recent one being in October, I think, when React Conf happened. So many new changes. React feels like a new thing now. Even though it's building on top of React 18 and a lot of the sort of initial stuff that was sent out, like automatic batching. So React 19 feels like a lot of new APIs have come out. We're going to talk about React 19.2 specifically, but even that has a lot of changes as compared to React 19. So I'm super excited to talk about all of that.
Me too. So the first feature that we wanted to talk about was the new activity component that has been introduced. So for people who aren't as familiar with activity, what can you expect when you start to use it or even just to see it in React applications today?
Yeah, so activity is one of the biggest features that's been announced in React 19.2, along with Vue transition. They go hand in hand. But talking specifically about activity, if you're familiar with conditional rendering, this will feel very similar because it's supposed to replace conditional rendering. Now, the problem with conditional rendering so far has been, let's say that you're typing in a search field at the top, like in google.com, you type something like React 19 and then you move to a different tab or you dismiss the search icon and then you open it again, your text is lost. So typically, we have been trying to keep that text in the state by adding like use state to it or keeping it in our state management libraries. So all of that stuff we've been doing manually. Now with activity, that is given to you out of the box. So you don't need to actually store state. So with activity, we have the ability to restore state and pick up from where we left off. And why this is going to be helpful is like in this example where you type something in search, you can open search again and you'll see your text item. So that's really cool. And then that can be super helpful, especially if you want to show like search items that are based on what you just searched. So that's really cool. But another thing that I'm super excited about is actually a demo that I built for Netflix. And imagine that you're scrolling in Netflix and you scroll through 6 different movies and now you're on like the third page of the movies. With activity, you can actually store state of where you were. You don't need to do anything else, which is really cool. You just wrap your component inside activity and your state is stored to where you were. Another great example, which I also did in a video that I worked on, is you know how in Netflix, when you hover on a movie, it starts playing your trailer, but then when you hover away, the trailer stops. And then if you hover back on it, it restarts from the top. I hate that. I want to continue from where I was because I kind of want to watch the trailer without actually clicking on the thing. And then I want to resume it. So with activity, that is given to you out of the box. So in an example, I actually wrapped that component. I built a Netflix clone and I wrapped that component in activity. And with that, you can actually resume the trailer from where you left off without having to do anything. And it is amazing to see this kind of improvement because I have been writing that restore state for so long in all of my apps. So I'm super excited to see this.
Are there any situations where you wouldn't recommend devs reach for activity?
Yeah, one of the big things about activity is that when activity is added to a component, it wouldn't, when your component is unmounted, it wouldn't actually run your use effects in the background. So what happens is when activity is added to a component, it actually adds like a display none property. And then when your component is hidden, the effects are also unmounted. So if you were calling like previously how we've been calling APIs and use effects, if that's what you're still doing, then you won't get the benefits of pre-rendering your content, which is something that activities docs talk about. So with activity, you can actually preload your data on for example, if you have multiple tabs, you can preload some of your tabs. However, if you're not using Suspense powered libraries or use, you won't see that effect. So in that case, because your effects are not running, if it's hidden, you won't see the benefits of activity. So that is something to keep in mind. Another thing is sometimes it causes side effects. Like in the video example that I was showing, sometimes what happens is that because that item is already added in the DOM, the video element is already in the DOM, it is already playing. When the effect gets, or when the component gets unmounted, sometimes the video keeps running, which can be a problem. So I actually had to add a use effect and do cleanup of that video element, which is basically stop playing the video element. So that is something to keep in mind. You could have some weird side effects with activity, especially if you're working with DOM elements.
And you said that when you were talking about it, that activity and view transitions go hand in hand. So do you want to talk about how view transitions can work with it or work in addition to it?
Yeah, actually at ReactConf 2025, activity and view transitions were one of the biggest features that were talked about. And what's cool about view transitions is activity, it helps to restore state. View transitions helps to automatically animate objects in, which is really cool. So let's say that you have a scroll position, or like you're scrolling through and then you open that item. You imagine Netflix, you scroll through the list of movies and then you open an item. So with view transition, you can actually have a really cool zoom out effect, and you don't need to do anything else. You just need to wrap your component with view transition. And then you can have the one thing that you need to do with view transition is to trigger the transition with start transition. Once you add that, you can get a automatic CSS effect, automatic animating effect out of the box. You can also modify it to something else, fade out or fade in, or zoom out or pan out, whatever you want to do. They go really hand in hand, because with activity, you get restoration of state. And then once you want to like move to that element, let's say you switch to a tab, you can have a really cool like animating effect with it. So this way, it's the user experience looks a lot better without you having to do much.
That's awesome. So finally, we don't need so many extra React Framer and React Spring and all those extra animation libraries to get transitions and animations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So one of the things about React Framework libraries is that they are very granular on the items that they animate. View transition is a little bit different from that, because it looks at the object or like your component as like one big image. So imagine that you add view transition to your components. It's thinking of it as one big block and it's just moving that block. Whereas with Framer, you get more fine grained control over it. With view transition, you can think about it as moving blocks on the page and transitioning blocks.
Nice. All right. So another new thing that was debuted was the use effect event. And it seems like we get more React hooks all the time. So how does use effect event separate event logic from effect logic? And what does this mean for a React developer who wants to start using it or understanding it?
Yeah. So useEffectEvent is a hook that I was extremely excited about before going to ReactConf. And once going to ReactConf, I realized this is not the star of the show that I thought it was. I was very excited about useEffectEvent because one of the biggest sources of our problems in React code is use effect. So I was very excited that finally we have a hook that's going to help to clean up use effects. That's still the case, to be honest. So the way use effect event works is in our use effects, we could have reactive logic and non-reactive logic. So reactive logic is stuff that we want our component to re-render for. So imagine that you land on a page and you have a user profile and the user's name changes, let's say. So you would want your component to re-render, if you have a profile name component, to re-render when name changes, right? So that is a reactive logic. That is a reactive value. That kind of content goes in use effect. But let's say when you land on the page, you want to log which page the user landed on. So you would have content like their username, their profile, whatever, right? At that point, you probably want to log impressions that the user is on slash profile page, and you want to probably capture their name, whatever it might be. But maybe when the name changes, it doesn't matter to you. You don't care about their name change. So you don't want to relog that analytic, right? So in that case, that is a non-reactive logic. You do want to log an impression, but you don't want to react to the name change if you're logging analytics. In that case, you could move this non-reactive logic into a use effect event. So use effect event actually is a hook. The reason it's called use effect event is because it's a hook that's made for use effect to clean up use effects. So the idea is that you move like event logic, which is you land on the page, you don't care about reactive value, that kind of logic into a use effect event, and then you keep your reactive values within use effect. And why this helps us is because if we add any value in use effect, that actually forces us to add them in the dependency array as well, which is what
Mhm.
causes the component to re-render. Now, adding a item in useEffectEvent does not trigger that warning, so that prevents us from adding dependencies that shouldn't go there. So that's the logic. Now, useEffectEvent goes hand in hand with useEffect, and useEffectEvent should not be used without a useEffect hook.
I think every developer who's ever worked in React probably has gotten that warning too when they have not put a dependency into their use effect, even though a lot of times it makes perfect sense. Like when you add it as a dependency, suddenly you get stuck in an infinite loop and things go wrong. So this is what use effect event is trying to help solve.
Yeah. And I have added that React exhaustive no depths warning so many
Yep.
times. So excited that I'm going to be cleaning up my use effects.
Are there any cases where people might actually misuse the use effect event just to silence those lint warnings?
I can imagine that people might be using it to just silence the warnings. But in fact, the docs also recommend that this is not just like an escape hatch from those dependencies. You got to first make sure that your effects are cleaned and you're not having any dependencies that shouldn't go in there. But if there are dependencies that you don't want to react to, that's the only thing that should move into use effective. And it's not an escape hatch from those warnings.
Nice. All right. Another new thing that was added or announced was cacheSignal. And cacheSignal, according to the React team, it enhances React server components by letting you react to cache lifetimes. So, can you talk about why this is important for RSC heavy apps?
Yeah, so this is a like RSC dependent update. So what cacheSignal does is it gives you an abort signal for React Server components. So abort signal, if anybody's not familiar, that's just used to cancel fetch requests. So in React Server components, we might be fetching multiple APIs, we might be having parallel data requests. So what abort signal or this cache signal would do is if you want to stop rendering of that fetch request, or if you want to abort that fetch request, cacheSignal will check if it is aborted, same way as how abort signal works, and then it'll help to cancel that fetch request. One of the advantages of it is it's going to help us prevent running expensive requests on the server and abort them if we need to. And an example that I can think of is if you are moving between navigations and you want to load data on one page and your component is rendering, but you move to another page, you want to abort that request, and on the server, cacheSignal will be helpful.
Nice. Good. And in addition to like things that will enhance the performance, make your app work better, there were some new Chrome DevTools React specific performance tracks that were added. Can you talk a little bit about what those are or why developers might want to take advantage of them?
Yeah, so performance tracks are actually part of your browser console itself, which is awesome because you don't need to install any external extension like React Developer Tools to get them. They're actually really cool. So if you've been using Profiler, you would notice that Profiler really helps you understand which components are taking longer and which components are re-rendering multiple times. What performance tracks helps you do is get a very like detailed and dissected view of what the component is doing in which phase. So they come as part of Chrome DevTools in React 19.2. You don't need to do anything else. The way this works is that you navigate to your performance tabs and you click on the record profiler. I think it's called record profiler or record something. So you click on record and then you check out your component, do what you need to do, and stop recording. Then you'll see that it'll have a new custom track, which has like a React icon, which shows you these are the performance tracks called scheduler, where you'll see different phases of where that component is passing into. So the render cycle, commit cycle, and a suspense cycle. And it will also show you the phases in which the component is blocked. So for example, let's say that you're fetching data, you're actually waiting for that fetch request to complete. So in the performance track, it'll show you that it spent these many seconds being blocked. And then if you actually have a suspense callback, it'll also show you that suspense triggered in and it spent this much time in the suspense fallback. So that way it's really cool to see why a component is taking that long in a very detailed view. It's much better than React Profiler because React Profiler kind of tells you the component is re-rendering multiple times, it's taking this long. But performance tracks actually tell you what the component is doing while it is waiting, which is really cool.
Are there any suggestions, or maybe this is something that Google will build in with Gemini, like how to improve the performance of your application based on the performance profile or tracks?
So what I've noticed is that Google's AI tools built in within Chrome DevTools actually already give a really good view of this component spent this long. So it'll actually show you this component spent like this much time in load. And with the help of React performance tracks, you can see that it spent that much time in blocking, and then it'll show you like what it was doing in the background. So both of those data combined, like AI DevTools already in Chrome and the React performance tracks, it's such a great way of debugging your components and understanding what it is doing when it is doing that. Yeah. And it's already in DevTools, so there's nothing new that needs to be added.
Nice. So one thing were that there were some React DOM updates that were announced, partial pre-rendering and the resume APIs. I know that you've talked about it in the context more of like Next.js, but how does partial pre-rendering figure into the more core React ecosystem now or framework?
Yeah, so partial pre-rendering also is one of the things that is going to be enabled by a framework. But the idea behind partial pre-rendering is it's in between static generation or static sites and dynamic sites, which is completely server rendered. So with partial pre-rendering, we can actually have static parts of the site and then have the dynamic parts of the site filled in. So this is how Suspense works. So what happens is we have a static part of the site generated, and then we can mark certain parts where we want the dynamic content to fill in. I think in React 19.2, what was announced was the ability to resume and pause pre-rendering. And again, this is for a framework, so I'm interested to see how frameworks are going to implement it. But yeah.
Are there problems that you think partial pre-rendering can solve that traditional server-side rendering or static have struggled with?
Yeah, so one of the biggest problems with static sites is that if we have dynamic content, we have to rebuild the page, right? Whereas on the other hand, if we have server side content or like server rendered apps completely, then even though there may be parts of the app that are fully static, like for example, a blog post or images, we we like completely discard all of that and we regenerate all of that. So they are both on either ends of the spectrum. And with partial pre rendering, what we can do is we can send the static parts of the site, like images and blog posts, and then fill in places where we need to add dynamic parts. So this way, we get the benefits of the static part, which is we show the first shell to the user fast, but also anything that we need to compute at runtime, we can have advantages of that as well, which is the server side part of the app where we can get the dynamic parts as well. So we get the advantages of the static side and we get the advantages of the dynamic side.
Do you think that partial pre-rendering is ready for development teams to use, or is it still kind of a wait and see situation?
So I know that in Next.js 16, there have been updates to partial pre-rendering with cache components. And I believe cache components are now stable. So with Next.js, it is ready to use. I don't know how without Next.js you would use partial pre-rendering since it's a framework dependent thing. So I'm not sure there. But if you're using Next.js, it's ready. Actually, Next.js 15 also introduced, I believe 15 or 14, introduced partial pre-rendering in an experimental state. So it's been around for a while.
Okay. So basically, if you're building a production React app, and as most people are using Next.js, it might be worth giving it a shot.
Yeah.
Cool. Another thing was suspense boundary batching, which you touched on really briefly. So talk a little bit about that and what people can expect from it or what it is exactly.
Yeah, the way I think of it is similar to how view transitions work. Like initially, pre 19.2, when your suspense, if you have multiple components that have suspense, or like let's say you have a component that has multiple components, they are all fetching data. During streaming, they will all sort of render in as they start coming in. With 19.2, they are now batched together. They come as like one big blocks. There are some fine tuning in there in the sense that if React notices that some components are ready much faster than other, it'll actually send those components in. So you are not actually completely waiting for all of the components to batch in. So there is some throttling happening there. But the idea is initially we were streaming in components as they were ready. But with 19.2, we're going to wait for them, we're going to batch them, and then stream them in. There was a second question, which I completely forgot.
How noticeable will this be for end users or even for developers? Is there going to be like Is it going to seem like it's faster? Is it going to potentially seem like it's slower because it's waiting? Like, how do they manage that or balance that?
I think one of the biggest things that I would say that you would notice is because now the content kind of batches in together, it would feel that the app is less janky because there is less like patch in content. In terms of performance, I specifically haven't seen much difference in whether it is more slow. The perceived, or like for me, the perceived performance has been the same. I don't know metrics about it if there has been any difference, if it feels more slow. So the one difference that I've seen is that it feels less janky. I don't know if the performance is slower.
But as you said, it's important that it's fast, but it's more important that our users feel like it's fast. So
Yeah.
that's the main thing.
Yeah.
Are there any other things about React 19.2 that we haven't touched on yet that you think people should be aware of?
One of the biggest and most anticipated releases, React compiler, is now stable. And the cool thing is that not just with React 19, it'll also work with 17 and 18, which is something that I'm super excited about because React compiler actually enables you to remove your use callbacks and use memos so your app can be auto memoized. And now it is compatible with 17. So I cannot wait to remove my use memos and not have to worry about memoization again.
Yes, that's going to be a huge lifesaver for so many developers.
Yes. Oh, there is a new version of ESLint plugin React hooks, which we should talk about. So there is V6 version of ESLint plugin React hooks, which is going to help with useEffectEvent dependencies, useEffectEvent warnings. But also now it also understands when React compiler is added. So you'll see warnings for those as well. So excited about the new plugin.
Yes, like you said, it's super helpful when those plugins will help you find those things in your code that you can delete. That's such a good feeling. Shruti, it has been a pleasure having you on today. Thanks so much for sharing the new updates with React 19.2 with me and with our audience.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody who's out there listening. We will see you again on the next episode of PodRocket.